And now we move on to the second presentation by Tim Behrens from Oxford on learning, volatility, and the anterior cingulate cortex. I should say as a matter of introduction that Tim Behrens has multiple talents. The Oxford group in neuroimaging is very well known for the development of beautiful tools and methodological advances, especially in the domain of fiber tracking in the human brain. So they have a very strong methodological component of human brain imaging. But Tim is also very interested in the development of models of decision-making and evaluation, and I think this is what he's going to describe to us today. So Tim Behrens.
Thanks very much indeed, Stanislas, for inviting me and for the other organisers. It's an amazing place. It's a real pleasure to come along. It's a bank holiday in the UK, so I've given up a day's holiday to come over to Paris. I'm going to speak today about learning, volatility, and the ACC. I don't know quite what the audience is like, but for a neuroscience audience, the letters ACC have some significance. For other people here, it means the anterior cingulate cortex, which is a particular structure in the brain. But I'm going to try and talk about this in quite a specific way. And what I'm going to try and do is I'm going to take a couple of results that have come from making lesions to the brains of macaque monkeys. And these two results at first appear to be really rather different from one another in rather different fields of neuroscience. And I'm going to try and explain them with some computational and economic ideas and with some data from human brain imaging experiments. So the first thing to do, I think, is just to take you through these results, these first two results. So this is a study that came from our lab in the field of reinforcement-guided decision-making. So all the way through here, I'm going to be talking about, not about the process of making a decision like Hilke was talking about, but rather about the process of learning from the outcome of your decision so that you can make a better decision in the future. So this is in the field of reinforcement-guided decision-making, and this is the behavior of some monkeys, and all it shows is the influence of your previous outcomes on your current decision. So this is the very last outcome. This is the outcome just before that. So you can see that the very last outcome that you just experienced has a great influence over what you're about to do next. The one before that has rather less influence, but still a significant influence. And you can see this curve of integration, this integration curve, such that the monkeys are, in essence, integrating over a number of previous experiences in order to make the best choice at the current trial. And then we would make a lesion. So we would remove part of the brain, and in this case we're moving the sulcal portion of the anterior cingulate cortex. And I'll tell you a little bit about that later, so don't worry if that's not familiar to you. But when we make this lesion, and then we ask the monkeys to do the tests again, we can see a dramatic effect. So now the only data point, the only trial that has any significant influence over the monkey's current behavior is the very last trial that it recently experiences. And this beautiful integration curve just completely collapses after a lesion to the anterior cingulate sulcus. So that's the first experiment. That's the first result I'm going to try and explain. The second result I'm going to try and explain is really appears to be a completely different a result in a completely different field of neuroscience. It appears to be in the field of social decision making and social valuation. So this is a result that this is based on the fact that monkeys will sacrifice food, will pay to do various things, and one thing they'll pay to do is to look at other monkeys, particularly if the monkeys are higher up in the social order. So this monkey here has the opportunity to get a piece of food, but just behind the camera there was a still picture of this monkey, and so the question is, will the monkey take the food or not? And so if you run it, you can see the monkey is not prepared to take the food. He's occasionally, if anything, I mean, it's very difficult to interpret from his behavior what he's doing, but it looks as though he might be trying to occasionally snatch glances at the other monkey, as if he's trying to perhaps get some information, to get some social information about this other monkey. And there's various pieces of evidence from this experiment which suggests that's the case, which I'll tell you about later. But in the meantime, I'm just going to let you know that a very similar lesion, but to a slightly different part of the brain, called the gyral portion of the anterior cingulate cortex, which is just next to the sulcal portion. If we make that lesion this time, then we can get behavior like this. So here the monkey takes the food, happily takes the food, and then even after he's eaten the food, shows no interest at all in the other monkey, in the social stimulus that's available. Okay, so those two results appear to be extremely different. But I'm going to try and persuade you through the course of a number of ideas and experiments that these two results are essentially the same thing but in two different domains. I'm going to try and persuade you that they're all about how much you value a piece of information. So, as I said, I'm just going to tell you a little bit about the anterior cingulate cortex because I know that not everybody here will know about it. So this is the anterior cingulate cortex in a macaque monkey. This red area here is the anterior cingulate sulcus, which caused the reward effect, and this blue area here is the location of the lesion for the anterior cingulate gyrus, which caused the social effect. So often if we're in neuroscience, if we want to understand the role of an area, we do so by looking at its function, but also we look at the connections because the connections are really important in constraining what function a brain region can do because they tell it what information it has to process and what other areas it can influence by its connections. A bit like if you were if you were looking at a computer circuit, you wouldn't just look at the processor, you would look at what other regions it has access to and what other regions it can influence. So here I'm just going to tell you a little bit about the connections of the anterior cingulate cortex. And I'm going to tell you particularly about differences between the sulcus and the gyrus because they're relevant here. So the anterior cingulate cortex has various connections, the sulcus has various connections that the gyrus just doesn't have. And these regions are mainly to regions that know about the motor output of the brain, know about your own actions. So these regions here, the primary motor cortex, the parietal motor areas, the spinal cord, these areas know about what actions you have taken. So, and if you remember, lesions to this region affected the influence of reward on your own actions. And the gyrus, by contrast, has many connections that the sulcus does not have, and these connections predominantly are to regions that deal with stimuli that might be emotional or social in nature. So all these regions here have been hypothesized to code information, social information or information about expected pain or emotions. So this region has access that the sulcus does not have to information about other agents, and that's part of the reason we hypothesized that this lesion would have an effect on the social evaluation task that I showed you, and it's nice that it's therefore understandable that it would have this effect. But there are also some connections that are really common between the two, which is why we have some hypotheses about their role being rather similar. It's not just because they're next to each other. Firstly, firstly, they're both connected very strongly to regions that process reward and motivation, for example. So these are some of the regions that Hilke was talking about, and they're very involved in processing reward and motivation. But themselves, they share one of the densest connections that you can find anywhere in the brain between the gyrus and the gyral and the sulcal portion of the anterior cingulate cortex. So reward and valuation and information from reward is going to affect signals in both of these regions. Okay, so that's the end of my intro about the anterior cingulate sulcus. I'm just going to go back to this first study. I'm now going to try and explain this data computationally and with some functional MRI data. So I'll just remind you, what happens when you remove the anterior cingulate sulcus from a macaque monkey is he's no longer able to integrate information over a number of trials in order to make the best decisions. So in order to understand why this might be, we figured the first thing to know is what might determine this integration length. So here's that plot again without the error bars, just to make it clear. And you can see that our monkeys, in order to make their next decision, only need information from perhaps the last 4 or 5 trials. But at the same time, at a very similar time, there was an experiment done in Stanford by a group including Bill Newsom, Leo Segru, and Greg Corrado, and they had rather a different experience. They found their American monkeys, instead of being able to make a decision on the basis of 4 trials information, they needed nearer 35 or 45 trials for these American monkeys to get enough information to make a decision. Now, I can't tell you how proud we were of our monkeys when we found out that our monkeys could learn in just 4 trials, but the American monkeys needed 45 trials. And we were thinking there might be something unique to the educational environment in Oxford which led to fast learning. But then we thought there might be some more ecological and evolutionary reasons to describe this difference. And we looked at differences between the experiments. And the crucial difference is that the Stanford monkeys were operating in an environment which was stable, so the probability of reward on a particular option might stay the same for a long number of trials, such that information from 50 trials back is still relevant and important because it still carries some, it still might influence what happens at the next trial. Whereas our monkeys, the reward probabilities changed very, very fast, indeed approximately every 25 trials. If our monkeys had had such a long integration curve, they would have been acting in a very suboptimal way because information from 30 trials ago, because of the experimental design, bore no relevance on what might happen at the forthcoming trial. So they really should not use that information, and it's great because they do not. So in some sense, we wondered whether these monkeys were able to adaptively process the statistics of the reward environment they were working with, and to i.e. process the volatility, which is a sort of statistic of the reward environment, and then to set their rate of learning, their rate of integration of reward, the same, or appropriately, optimally. So we designed an experiment to test this. Oh no, I'm just going to tell you something a little bit about how you might do that first. So in order to know how you might do that, and in order to understand some of the rest of the data, you need to understand something which has become a very influential theory in, over the last 100 years in psychology, and recently in brain imaging as well, and this is reinforcement learning, so this gives us some ideas about how one might change that integration length and how one might update your preferences or update your valuations in the context of receiving some new information. And it's really very simple indeed, or at least the part of it that I'm going to rely on is really very simple indeed. It just assumes that you have before you make a decision, like Hilke was saying, you have some prediction of the value that you're going to get out of this decision, and then you receive an outcome, and your job is to update this prediction such that next time you make this decision, the prediction is rather better, because then you'll make a better decision next time around. That's what we call learning. So in order to do so, what we think happens is we think that people compute a prediction error, which is the difference between the outcome and the prediction, and you make some new prediction, which is just the old prediction plus some fraction of the prediction error. And this really rather simple algorithm explains a great deal of neural data. So here's the equation again, and this prediction error has been a very influential thing. It tells you how much information is available from the event that you're currently witnessing. And then this learning rate doesn't tell you anything about the information that you're currently witnessing, but it tells you how much you should weight this particular piece of information in contrast to information that you've already received. Because this value here, the value of the previous predicted value, contains all the information you've previously learnt about, and then this tells you the weight of the current trial. So what you should do is you should set the weight of the current trial to the statistical value of the information. So if you're working in a very fast environment, new information is much more valuable to you than old information, but if you're working in a very stable environment, old information is much more valuable to you. So you should set this learning rate in order to maximize the use of the information that you receive. And I'll just show you that there's a monotonic one-to-one relationship between this learning rate and the integration curves that I've been showing you before. So if I plot these integration curves with a very slow learning rate, I get a very long integration curve. I can plot it instead with a very fast learning rate, and I get a very fast, a very sharp integration curve, much like my monkeys. And you can choose one in the middle. And you can get one much like the Stanford monkeys. So by fiddling simply with this one parameter, the monkeys might be, when they update their beliefs, the monkeys might be able to change those integration curves that we were talking about before. Okay, so now on to an experiment. This is a very simple experiment where humans now just simply have to choose between a blue and a green square. There are different values. There are different monetary values associated with these, but don't worry about that for now. Essentially, the task here is to learn the probability that that either blue or green will be rewarded. Only one of them will be rewarded, so you have to learn a probability. You have to learn that probability that it's blue rather than green. And so what we did is, so this is the probability that the subjects had to learn. This is the probability that the outcome will be blue. And if they choose blue and the outcome is blue, then they'll be rewarded. So you can see here the trick that we've done. We have a phase in the experiment when this probability is stable, it doesn't change at all. And we have a phase when this volatility is changing fast, is volatile. So you can see, so here, just by observing the outcomes, subjects are going to have to try and learn this probability. But subjects could never learn exactly this probability, of course, because what they can learn depends not on the underlying probability, but on the observations that they can make, the outcomes of particular trials. So we had to build an optimal learner, a Bayesian learner, which told us how much one could possibly learn from the observations that the subjects receive. And the outcome of that Bayesian learner looks a little bit like this. And there are several things to notice about this, but the key ones are that by the end of the stable phase, each new observation is causing very, very little impact on the estimation of the probability. So that means that the learning rate, the amount that the newest piece of information is contributing, is very, very small indeed. By contrast, in the volatile phase, a new piece of information can have a massive impact on what you should think. So if you understand that the world is volatile, then you should believe that a new piece of information should change your beliefs an awful lot. I'm just going to... So we went and measured this behaviorally, and so we measured subject learning rates in the stable phase and then again in the volatile phase, and you can find a significant difference between the two. So much as we thought from the monkeys, humans are able online to change their learning rate based on the statistics, the volatility of the current environment. And not only can they do it, but they can do it pretty well. These black dots here are the behavior of the optimal Bayesian learner. So humans are meta-learning. They're they're hierarchically learning how fast to learn. And then we can flip the experiment, and we can perform the volatile phase first. And so again, it's not a block ordering effect. So then we can move to imaging, and much like in many experiments, changes in our predicted reward happen throughout the course of the experiment. But as I've just explained, it's also true that the volatility of the environment, and therefore how much you should learn from each new piece of information, that also changes throughout the course of the experiment. So, so we run this experiment, and we can first we can look at some rather simple contrasts, which include what parts of the brain are active just when you're making a decision, and you can see huge amounts of the brain are active just when you're making the decision. And then you can look at what parts of the brain are active when you're monitoring the outcome of a decision. So you can see here, this here is the cingulate cortex. So you can see, again, huge parts of the brain, including the cingulate cortex, but slightly different parts of the cingulate cortex are active when you're looking at a reward versus when you're making a decision. And then we can do the crucial contrast, which looks at the time of the outcome of a trial, which brain area has activity which parametrically fluctuates with the volatility of the environment, i.e., which part of the brain tells us how much we should learn from this current piece of information. And when we do that, we find activity in the sulcal region of the anterior cingulate cortex, exactly the region that we lesioned in those macaque monkeys. And we're interested to know that this region of the anterior cingulate sulcus lies exactly at the border between the regions that are interested in monitoring outcomes and regions that are interested in making future decisions, which is appropriate since the role of this is to learn the impact of a current outcome on a future decision. So here this region, we propose this region is involved in telling various other systems how much to learn from a current outcome. And I'm just going to show you a couple of plots to try and convince you that it's a learning signal. The first is just a plot of its effect through time in a trial. There are a number of things that the anterior cingulate cortex does that are involved in processing a decision, making a decision, and you can see that this really is not one of them at all. There's no effect here during the time when the subject is making a decision. There's no effect after they've made a response before they see an outcome. The moment they see an outcome, there's a massive response which is proportional to the volatility of the environment, to the amount they should learn. And the second thing is, not only do we have variability within an experiment about how much a subject should learn, we also have variability between subjects. So some subjects in general are very fast learners, and other subjects in general are rather slower learners, and we can perform a correlation in this region across subjects between the bold signal at the outcome time and their overall learning rate. And it turns out that the faster you are to learn in general from your outcomes, the higher your bold signal in this anterior cingulate region will be at the time of the outcome again. Okay, so that's the end of part one. That is the end of the part where I've tried to describe the sulcal effect. So I'm just going to go back and remind you of the gyral effect. So ACC gyral animals will ignore the presence of a social stimulus when offered some food, and even after. So they won't look at a social stimulus, for example, in an attempt to get value, to get social information, sorry. And just another quick slide on that result. It's interesting to note what I'm plotting here is the amount of time the monkeys will wait before taking that food reward. And on the bottom, I'm plotting various different monkeys that are shown to them in the background. And you can see that a staring dominant monkey makes them wait a long time. A female monkey, perineer, which is the scientific name for genital organ of a female monkey, makes them wait a long time. And then, as you go down, it seems like the more valuable, socially valuable the image is, the longer they will wait. But if we make a gyral, a lesion to the anterior cingulate gyrus, you can see that effect completely disappears. So not only on average do they wait less time, but there's now no influence at all. There's no influence at all on how socially useful, how valuable the information will be. Okay, so now I'm going to run a very similar experiment from the last one with one simple trick. And that simple trick is, before making a decision between a blue or green square, the subjects are going to receive a piece of advice from a confederate sitting outside the scanner. So here, the person's going to say, choose the blue option. But the confederate sitting outside the scanner, via various manipulations, might have very different motives from the person in the scanner. He may want the person to win, he may want the person to lose, he may want the person to do not quite as well. So the person in the scanner now has two parallel learning problems. The first learning problem he has is he has to work out the probability that the correct colour is blue exactly as he had before. This is a simple sort of stimulus-reward, stimulus action outcome learning problem. And then the second learning problem that he has at the same time is to learn the probability that the confederate, the person sitting outside the scanner, will give him good advice, is on his side. So he's learning the current motives of the confederate. So you can see these. You can see that obviously when we do these experiments, we don't actually let somebody sitting out the experiment dictate the experiment. We control it with a computer, but the subject inside the scanner believes they're playing against a real human being. So we can control the confederate's lies. So this is the probability of a true advice, and then, so we can use this other trick. So again, just like before, we can control the volatility or the value of information about the action that you make, and we can control the volatility of the social information, and we can ensure that these two signals contain no information about one another. They decorrelate from one another. So then, when you receive a single outcome, at the same time you receive two pieces of information, one about the confederate and one about the reward outcome, the action outcome contingency. But crucially, at some points in the experiment, both will be very informative. At other points in the experiment, there will be little information about the reward, but lots of information about the social situation, and etc., etc. So that we should see independent fluctuations in the bold signal between regions coding for these two different parameters. So the first thing to do then is to assess whether it's even possible that social information is processed in a similar way to reward information. So reward information has been addressed in many single unit recording studies, many fMRI studies using this reinforcement learning. It's a very simple learning algorithm. But it might be thought that social information may be processed by a much more complicated process, which does a lot of mentalizing, imagining what other people would do. So in order for statements about the volatility and the learning rate to be valid, we need to assess whether our subjects are performing are integrating actions about other individuals in a reinforcement learning style way. And so this is just a behavioural finding. So this is we've modelled their behaviour based on just the magnitude difference in reward, a reinforcement learning algorithm based on the outcomes, a reinforcement learning algorithm based on the confederate advice, and then two other possible strategies that the subjects might have made for learning about the confederate advice. So this is just following what the confederate says all the time. And then this one is using a tit-for-tat strategy. So assuming that the subject will lie if he lied last time, or will tell the truth if he told the truth last time. So although we can't be sure that they're using exactly reinforcement learning approaches from this plot, we can be sure at least that they're integrating information across trials in the way that reinforcement learning would suggest, because otherwise this tit-for-tat policy would do much better than the reinforcement learning policy at predicting behaviour. And we have another piece of neural evidence. So this is a very, very common finding in reward learning paradigms, which happens in this ventral striatum and also in some in dopaminergic areas such as the VTA. So what happens is when you make a decision, you get an expectation about how much you will receive from this trial, and then when you get an outcome, you get a positive effect of the reward that you'll see, and you get a negative effect of the expectation. So you have a reward minus the expectation. That's exactly that prediction error signal that you previously saw in those mathematical slides. And this is a very, very common finding throughout reinforcement learning research. So the question is, would we find such a similar signal in the social domain which would really convince us that something like temporal difference learning, like reinforcement learning was happening for the social paradigm? And again, we can look for that using brain imaging, and we find some regions that are very commonly activated in social tasks involving theory of mind. But in this case, in this experiment, they're doing something really rather simple. They're coding for, again, the prediction that they're going to get before the outcome, and then after the outcome, they get a negative effect of the prediction and a positive effect of the event of a lie. So here again, we've got a classic prediction error on whether somebody else will lie to me. I'm expecting him to lie to me, and then he tells the truth, I get a negative signal. He lies, I get a positive signal. So these two pieces of evidence we thought were good evidence that the subjects were performing this social task in a very simple reinforcement learning type way. So then we thought the interesting thing is to go and look at the cingulate cortex and see if we see similar signals for the social value of social information as we do for the value of reward information or outcome information. And so we have these different signals, as I was explaining before, and we can look at the value of reward information just like we did before, and we can see again a signal in the sulcal portion of the anterior cingulate cortex. And then and this is very similar to the monkey lesion in the sulcal portion of the anterior cingulate cortex. And then we can do the corollary in the social domain, and we can look for a signal which looks like this, the value of social information. And when we do that, we see a signal in the gyral portion of the anterior cingulate cortex. And again, this looks really rather similar to the lesion which was in the gyral portion of the anterior cingulate cortex, which prevented an animal from paying to look at another animal, essentially. So this is evidence, I think, that not only is there an association between these two brain regions in terms of what domain of information they process, but that despite that dissociation, they're in fact processing really very similar things. They're processing the same computational parameter which relates to the value of the current piece of information that you're witnessing and its role in learning. And so we've got one other piece of evidence to support that. Actually, there's a couple of other ones. Here's the first one. I've shown you so far that the value of information across trials correlates with these things. But the next thing that we could ask is, does the value of information across subjects predict these things as well? So here, so obviously if you're playing a game where you're asked either to follow somebody's advice or to rely on your own experiences, there'll be some people a bit like George Bush that'll just do whatever he's told, and some people a bit like Dick Cheney who'll never listen to anybody else. And so if you so you can use that variance across different people to ask, do people that always do what they're told have bigger signals in the cingulate gyrus, and do people that always follow their own advice have bigger signals in the cingulate sulcus? And the answer to both of those questions is yes. So the last piece of information looks at a region of the brain that Heike was telling you about earlier. So this is a ventromedial part of the prefrontal cortex, which often, in many studies, has been activated in the context of the value of the thing that you're currently choosing. So here again, we can look for a signal which relates to the value of the thing that you're currently choosing, but we have an interesting flip on that, because in some people, in the Dick Cheneyites, this signal will look like this, but in the George Bushites, this signal will look like this. And these signals themselves decorrelate. So we can say, this signal, how much of it looks like that, and how much of it looks like that. And in doing so, we can then then correlate that with how much information they got from the cingulate cortex when they were witnessing that information beforehand. So this is during making a later decision, and then we can say, can we predict this brain signal here, which tells you how much I'm currently valuing things, by how active the anterior cingulate cortex region was at the time when I earlier witnessed that information. And so you can see that in the anterior cingulate sulcus, if I have a high activity when I witness a piece of information in the anterior cingulate sulcus, then later on this signal will look much more like the Dick Cheney signal. But if I have a high activity in the anterior cingulate gyrus when I'm witnessing that piece of information, then later on this value signal, will look much more like a George Bush style signal. So the cingulate signal, or the relative weight of the gyral and sulcal cingulate signal, predicts how you will integrate those two pieces of information into an overall value signal, which will then hopefully guide behavior. Okay, so that's me done pretty much. I'm just going to run over. We think that there's something to do with learning in the cingulate cortex. I don't know if you've got hold of that from my 40 minutes. It generally predicts, so across a number of different situations, it predicts inter-individual variability. We think there's some dissociation between the gyrus and the sulcus, such that the gyrus codes for social information and the sulcus codes for information about your own actions and rewards. But we think there's a striking similarity as to what processing they do in those two different situations. And the outputs of these parallel learning signals are processed in a region that Heike was talking about earlier. These are the key people, particularly Matthew Rushworth, who I work with in great detail. And, yeah. Is that too long?
I think it's a beautiful lecture, a beautiful example, actually, of what mathematical theories can contribute to understanding. In particular, the concept of theory of mind is still a very fuzzy concept, but here the notion of social value is given a mathematical definition. If I can ask the first question, maybe, is a consequence of your talk that humans don't differ from rhesus macaques in social evaluation, that we have a similar system in the anterior cingulate cortex, or are there aspects of social valuation in your experiments that are specific to humans?
So I think that macaque monkeys do social valuation, and I think that it's almost certain that they share some anatomical features and some anatomical structures that perform very similar jobs as those features do in humans. And the cingulate cortex is a very good example of a region that appears to be quite well preserved in terms of its function between a macaque monkey and a human. But some of those other regions that I showed you for the social prediction errors, some of those other regions, perhaps a lot less is known about the social function of those other regions in monkeys than is known in humans, particularly because a lot of the human results from those other regions focus on tasks that it's very difficult to know whether a monkey is doing. So things like theory of mind, understanding the intentions of another individual. And you could design tasks, and we've thought about designing tasks which try and look at whether a monkey is solving those tasks. But there are parts of those some of those brain regions have expanded dramatically between a macaque monkey and a human, and so it's not clear. I'm certainly not aware of anybody who's done a theory of mind study in a monkey and looked at recordings in the STS or the dorsal medial prefrontal cortex. It's not clear where the homologue of dorsal area 10 in a human would be in a monkey even. So yes and no. I mean, yes and no. I strongly think that there are parts of that social cognition relies on some structures that would not have evolved for social cognition, and I think the gyral portion of the anterior cingulate cortex might be one of them. But I'm not saying that all social cognition is processed in the same way between a monkey and a human.
John Elster.
You may have answered this question already, but I didn't. If so, I didn't get it. Are fast learners also fast meta learners?
Oh. So a fast meta learner is somebody who quickly learns that, and so you need a really complicated experiment to ask that question, because you have to have the rate of change of volatility changing through time. I haven't done that experiment, so I don't know the answer. And I think it might be, given how hard we struggled to design an experiment that would look at meta learning. I would be terrified at the prospect of designing an experiment which looked at meta learning, but maybe it's possible. I don't know. That is an interesting question.
I'm not sure whether you convinced me that what anterior cingulate cortex, the gyrus and sulcus are doing is really manipulating or controlling the learning rate, as opposed to sensing the changes in stability in the environment. That is, it's learning about volatility in your language, and hence passing that on to the standard brain circuitry that's involved in learning, and we also see implicitly learning rates like in the dopamine neurons.
So I'm not quite sure that I think there might be some detail in your question that I didn't get, but okay. So I'll tell you what I think is happening, and then you can tell me why I'm wrong. So I don't think it's computing the learning rate, partly, and I certainly don't think it's storing the learning rate, partly because it's only active at the time when it sees the outcome. So there must be some other regions that are doing some complex computations to either compute it or to store it. I think it is processing the influence of the learning rate on the action that you're currently seeing. I think there's neurons there saying, this is an important piece of information now, you should be learning from this one. But on other trials they're saying, don't learn from this one. That's what I think it's doing.
So it's basically recording the stability in the environment. From you take a choice, the stability has changed, you better change your learning rate. So it is a learning.
I don't think it's learning about the learning rate. I think it's processing the influence of the learning rate on how much you process the current trial. Exactly, that's what I think it's doing. Yeah.
Thank you for your talk. I have a question about one fact, a well-known fact. When you present subject a series of trials with a pure random factor, and subject found some spurious regularities, which actually doesn't exist. So it seems that actually subject doesn't adapt to a very stable environment, but creates some artifactual regularities. How would you interpret these findings in your framework?
I see. It's interesting. I haven't really thought about it in that context, but so I don't know why people always overinterpret stability as or probabilistic outcomes as patterns. It's absolutely clear that they do. And when we first designed these experiments, we had to go to a huge amount of effort in our instructions to subjects to tell them not to do so. We even explicitly told them there weren't any patterns A, B, in the data. So my suspicion is that the finding of such patterns relies on a very different cognitive process from the cognitive process that we've been investigating. But I don't think I have a better answer than that, really. I don't know, and I can just tell you that we tried as hard as we could to suppress that instinct in every subject that we instructed. But yeah.
Yeah, you may know Angela Yu, and she in a recent study she shows that actually there might be some like a default volatility used by subject.
Oh, I see. So they think that things are changing, but I see. So they just default integrate. Yeah, we never went and measured. I suppose I'm not sure how you could measure that, because by trying to measure it, you'd have to impose some volatility. Or you could just measure it under stability. You could measure that integration rate under stability. But you'd have to go a very long way, I think, because in order to understand that the world is 100% stable, you have to experience a great deal of trials. So I don't know. I haven't seen the study, but it does sound interesting. So they're not. So you're saying that they leak information even when they shouldn't. Yeah, I think that certainly is possible.
If I may ask a slightly related question, did your experiment provide evidence for social biases, or were subjects always accurate in their social evaluation? Was there, for instance, a collaboration bias, so they would initially assume that the person was cooperative rather than lying?
So I think the sort of formal answer to that question is given here. So this is a parameter which just lets them follow just follow whatever the collaborator does, and it's greater than 0, but not significantly so. But the informal answer is that if in the schedule, if we force the confederate to lie on the very first trial, then the subjects behave in a much more sensible way than if we don't force. Than if they're allowed to tell the truth for the first couple of trials, because it just sets up in the subject's mind the fact that this confederate really doesn't have the same motive as you. Once you believe there might be some shared motive, then this parameter would be higher. But if they know from the very outset that this guy might not have the same motive as them, then they seem to behave rather optimally. Yeah.
Unless there is an urging question, I think we're going to break now, and we're a little bit late, but I think we'll convene again in about 10 minutes at 11:15, if we can.